Welcome to a different kind of doula. I'm Maureen, and I'm here with my two guest show hosts, Kathleen and Colleen, and we are part of the Gentle Passage Doula Collective. Today, we're talking about death anxiety. You know, that fear of death. Do you have it? Most of us do. We fear the unknown. We ruminate on those that we love and care about dying. We ruminate about our own death and what that will be like. And we have a fear because in our culture, we don't talk about death. In the American culture, I know people are from all over the world, but in the American culture, it's sort of that taboo topic that we don't talk about. And we've addressed this issue before, and it's something that's so important. You're not alone if you have a fear of death. Even us as end of life doulas, we have a fear of death. And that's why we feel it's so important to keep talking about this. Those things that we don't talk about, we don't understand, and that leads to fear. We read an article by a clinical psychologist named Rachel Menzies, and they wrote a book, Mortals. And I'm just going to jump in by asking Colleen to share some thoughts on this topic of death anxiety.
Well, when I think about this, and we've talked, there's some days when I know I've immersed myself and exposed myself in all different kinds of ways to death and dying, but still have this underlying fear or anxiety. And I look back into childhood, and they say to do that because they say how it's viewed in childhood leads to how you are manifest in your health today. Do you have a generalized anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, something like that, or just plain anxiety about death and just shove it aside? But when I look back on my childhood, I loved walking through cemeteries. I loved it. And if you look at some people's childhoods, they don't like it so much. They stay away from it. They're scared. I would sit there and eat a sandwich by somebody's tombstone, and it didn't bother me, but I'm not so sure I had this full idea of what it all meant. And my parents, not my father as much, but my mother, because she was a nurse, would come home and she'd say, "Well, my patient died today, but in the maternal child section, there was a baby born." So I kind of got used to this circle of life and hearing about it and not, it just became part of her conversation. My dad, not so much, but her, yes. So there was some positives. And I also had a fear of death when I was a child because I had these reoccurring dreams of being buried alive.
Mm.
And then I would talk to my mother and I'd say, "Well, what happens after we die? Is there a heaven?" And she would answer, "Yes, there's a heaven. You go to heaven." Well, I had no idea what that really meant, but I was raised I was raised Catholic, so the church kind of gave me some preconceived thoughts about that as well. So I do think how we are in childhood, and lots of times it's just swept, Maureen, as you said, under the rug. So I'm just wondering, Kathleen, what are some of your thoughts on it now that I've exposed some of my fears?
Yeah, I have similar fears. And I think for me, when I think about the fear of death, just like thinking about the fear or resistance to talking about certain things in my life, it feels like a heart or a spiritual path for me to kind of like go to the depths of what feels scary. And especially when it feels taboo, nobody really wants to talk to you about it. And I remember when my sister-in-law died when I was in my 20s, I really started searching for answers. And to me, it kept coming up with that uncertainty. There's beliefs out there, but nobody can say with all certainty what the experience is going to be like and what happens after you die. And I think for me, the most important thing is to talk about it because when you avoid death and when you avoid how it's impacting you, or you have a belief system about the way that it is that relieves you, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for your child, your spouse, your family, your community. And so I think it's this allowance and acceptance and this open-heartedness, and also the ability to explore what you really think. And some of it might be conscious, and some of it might be because you were raised a certain way, or you were in a community a certain way, or you heard something at a really impressionable time in your development. So I think of grief and sorrow and death all going hand in hand. If we can't learn how to adequately grieve losses, all kinds of losses. And I think about Francis Weller's book, and his gates of grief. The first one is, all that we love, we will lose. We don't talk like that, but if we, it's that appreciation of being in the moment. And I really do believe that love and grief just go right together. If we truly love, if we put our heart and soul into something, it's going to be hard to let it go. And that's okay. That's part of the human condition.
I love that you say that. As you two know, I grew up in a family where we did not speak of death. We didn't. My grandfather died when I was in second grade, and I knew he was dying, but in second grade, I didn't have a conceptualization of death and what that meant. But I remember going to his funeral, but there was no talk afterwards. My mom was really sad, but we didn't know what to do. We just sort of buried it. And then my cousin died in a plane crash my senior year of high school. Grief, crying, but we didn't talk. We didn't sit down and talk about this. So I had a real fear of death. I thought, I don't want to talk about this stuff. I didn't want to think about it. And I got my first nursing job in oncology. And I thought, oh my gosh, let me get out of here as fast as I can. But I fell in love with it because I found that death wasn't scary. And people that are dying want to talk about it because they know. And the more we talk about it, the more we can accept it. It's inevitable. We are all going to die one way or another. So to talk and shine the light on this important topic, it actually helps us live more freely and more fully. One of the exercises I do with clients that I work with is walking them through their death experiences. What was your first experience with death? How old were you? What do you remember about it? How did it make you feel? And then, what's your most recent experience with death? And how did that make you feel? What was the worst experience you had with death? And unpacking all of that. It's just, I've watched people, I've had many people in my life die that I loved dearly. Some of them were younger, and I've watched a couple different people I know. One was my very closest friend, would not talk about the fact that she wouldn't even admit she was dying to her children. Another woman that I knew died around the same time, but she had very open, candid conversations with her kids about the fact that she was going to die. So watching these two sets of children navigate their grief, it was so profoundly different because one, the light had been shined on it, and the other, it had been kept in darkness.
That's fascinating, Maureen, about, well, you were actually doing a life review by saying, remember, these events in your life around death. Is one of the things that really has struck me is when I was in nursing, people would die all the time. I was taking care of them. I don't think, though, I ever connected the dots. And it wasn't until my mother died, and she died in such a special, beautiful way, that I started to look at it. But it wasn't until I started studying to be a doula that I realized what exposure how you, with exposure to certain things, you can, just systematically grow more comfortable around death and dying. And it didn't matter how many people I saw die. It was all of a sudden about, okay, watching movies. We watched movie clips. We read books, a lot of books, just inundated and saturated with books on death. And then hospice materials. That's how I learned about Barbara Carnes, and immersing myself in the materials that she had put out. And then all of a sudden you become really interested in reading about other people's stories and how they have lost loved ones and their reactions and responses. And you ask yourself, would I respond that way? Did I respond that way? And then, of course, I love the part where we put ourselves through our own death. We were told that we were going to be dying in a hospital. That is not where I wanted to be. But it became so real that all of a sudden I felt it. And that was interesting. Now, I'm not so sure I became comfortable around death, but I started to really look at the depths of it and start to look at, well, okay, so what is your plan around your dying process? And I'm sure the life review that you did, Maureen, with your clients, that led to that. What will be your life review? Who do you want there? Who don't you want there? What do you want a party? Do you not want a party? I mean, what do you want? And so all of these things. And today, death over dinner is very popular. And I think there's a high number, over 200,000 deaths over dinner. People now are becoming more exposed and more comfortable, and our death cafes today, too. So I think that whole thing is, as a person, you can be with death and you can see death, but until you start exploring on a different level and expose yourself to all aspects, that may help with some of the fears.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah. We were in the same class and went through the same exercise. And I remember it was very real. Like we put on a hospital gown and we laid down and we were told we couldn't move and we had to let the other person, and we were told we couldn't leave. And I remember my initial thing was like, yeah, you can always leave. You can always go AWOL. And then thinking, what if I couldn't physically move? And nobody was willing to move me out because I had so much resistance to going there. So here's the thing is it's really uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
It's really uncomfortable. And I had all this resistance. And then I had this thought go through my mind. You signed up for this. You came all the way up here and you're spending the nights up here. Like, do it. Like, what do you learn? So I remember just kind of like wanting to push it away. And I think that being compassionate about that, because what we don't know is scary. And I remember going through it and realizing, I'm pretty good. Like if this were true, I'm pretty good with people in my life right now. But there are a couple things I want my daughter to know. And so it really was enlightening and it was very uncomfortable. And I remember a similar exercise in hospice where we wrote down people, things, and places and stuff that's part of our everyday life that we find important and we want around us if we were to die. And then they slowly got taken away, except for 3. And again, I could resist and not even imagine what that would be like, but I made myself go in there and I had to tell myself a story about why some of my siblings weren't there and why I didn't have access to something. But I sat there and just felt it and came up with this reasoning. And I was like, I'd be okay. I'd be okay if it was my last hour. And these are the 3 things with me. These are the three things. But and that is nice. And I watched a clip with Jim Carrey, and he talked about being in Hawaii when they thought that they gave that alarm and thought that they were going to be struck. And I think that they had like a 10-minute warning. And so he was alone in a hotel room and just sat down. And, as you can imagine, processing it and processing it. And he said he came to peace.
Mm.
There's a lot of distress, but then coming to peace and resolve and acceptance. And so for me, I think when thinking about death and dying and the fear of losing someone that I love as well is really leaning into the discomfort and learning how to be present and what's really important, and not pushing it away and not powering through. I think we have a culture that pushes down things that are uncomfortable and we escape. And so learning how to cultivate that in our lives is important.
I've been through that practice, like you said, where they take things away. You have to write things down and they take things away. And only one of my sons was left. My husband wasn't, and my other two, and a couple material things. And I was just like devastated. But to really, like Jim Carrey, being in that moment where it's like, oh my gosh, this is happening. And how many times, I think of my cousin that died in the plane crash. What must he have thought? Because they knew for like 16 seconds. They said that it was 16 seconds that they knew they were not going to survive. But in those 16 seconds, I've often thought, what went through his mind? And I hope that he made peace with it too. And I think that that's by shining this light, by talking about it. That's what helps us cope in those moments. Like Jim Carrey coping in that moment. I don't ever want to be in that moment, but if I am, I hope that I would react like he did and find a place of peace. I hope in those 16 seconds that my cousin had, he found a place of peace. I think that, in reading the article that I was talking about by Rachel Menzies, she was saying that we have our coping skills and we use these unconsciously. And so many things we do in our life are coping so that because of death anxiety, we might not even realize it, but we want to attain things. We want to attain our professional status. We want to live in the nice house. We want to do these things to leave this legacy. And it's our way of unconsciously addressing our death anxiety. And I never would have thought of that. But the more I read about that, I thought I can totally relate to that. I don't know. What did you guys think when you read that?
Well, the leaving children behind, your children. And I thought it really points to our thing about permanence. We can't cope with being impermanent because it's impermanent, everything. But boy, if you have something solid you're leaving behind, oh, hey, that's permanent. What fascinates me with that whole thing with Jim Carrey coming to peace, and Maureen, you mentioned death anxiety. Well, people have a variety of different emotions, and but sometimes they focus on the emotion and they don't try to problem solve it or get comfortable. As Kathleen was saying, Jim Carrey got comfortable and peaceful with dying. But for example, some people might be worried about their own death and they focus on that. And sometimes they're worried about a loved one's death who was not even ill, but they're going to die. And they get so focused on that and carried away with that emotion. And then a very common one that I come across often is that people just think, well, what's after this? What if it's the light switch theory? You turn the light switch off and that's it. It's all dark. And they get really wrapped up in that. And then dying alone is another one. I don't want to die alone. But here's where cognitive behavioral therapy helps. You say, okay, now is that a really reality? Who could be with you? Aren't you going to have a doula? What about your family? Have you talked with? So you kind of dispel those fears instead of clutching to it and making it bigger than it really needs to be. So, but what it'll lead to is what you guys were talking about, you ladies were talking about, is that it leads to death anxiety if you hold on to that emotion without really changing your thought pattern about it.
Yeah. I love the questioning because if we can be curious and not judge ourselves, it makes it a lot easier to go there. The other part of it is sometimes we go to problem solving and don't feel, because that feels really comfortable to us. We just start to problem solve, but we don't really allow ourselves to feel the anger and the sadness and the fear or the mixture, which one's the deeper feeling there, sometimes it's sadness, sometimes it's fear, and sometimes it's anger,
Oh,
and sometimes it's guilt that people are carrying. And I think for me, I just recently visited somebody that went into hospice, and I have to admit that I woke up the day I was going to go visit and had some dread of seeing this person in a body that's not functioning and that the person's going to be different. My ability to communicate with them is going to be different. And then, like, yeah, I understand, this is hard. This doesn't feel good. There's not a part of me that goes, yay, ha, like in the past, because it's going to be uncomfortable and it's going to be painful to see somebody in this situation. And yet at the same time, I really, really am grateful for my mom saying, when someone's dying, show up. When there's a funeral, show up. And you don't have to say the perfect thing. You don't have to. So at the very beginning, and I remember throughout my life, she role modeled that. And she was always pretty comfortable with death and dying. And I think, I really love the 5 invitations, just real basic, simple. You don't have to do a lot of thinking or figuring it out, is just don't wait. That's a teacher. Death is a teacher. Don't wait for telling people you love them, that you're sorry, showing your gratitude, making sure that your goodbyes are peaceful, and welcome everything. That means fear, anger, sadness. But a lot of folks can't hold that. We don't have a lot of people who are safe to be angry in front of, scared in front of, sad, where we can be vulnerable. And then bring your whole self to the experience. So, if you're going to cry, cry. You don't have to be a certain way. And I don't know how many times you guys had this, but my whole life was don't cry, be strong,
oh, yeah.
buckle up, stiff upper lip, keep going. You're so emotional. So then learning how to shut the body down and then really have that tension in your body to not cry. And that's significant because that fear of showing your sadness now is accompanying your grief. And
Right.
then find a place of rest in the middle of things. And I have to say, even though I have a practice, even though I'm a doula, even though I've sat with a lot of people through grief, various kinds of grief, sitting on the bed and realizing that I was going to have to pause for a long time for someone's response, for my friend to be able to respond to me. It took a lot of mindfulness to just wait. And then I got all these gifts, right? Because then she was able to say things to me. And it's just pause, breathe. This is uncomfortable. It's okay. You can be okay, uncomfortable. And then really, I think getting back to when we die, what happens? Like all the things you said, Colleen, it's like all those things, it's like it fills up my head and it makes me go, even now, like, but we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow.
Mhm.
And to be okay. And research has shown is if we can cultivate a mind of embracing the unknown, we're a lot happier. We're not stressing and resisting and scared to face the future.
I love everything you just said because we do our anxiety takes over everything. And I love the fact that you talked about the emotions of grief. When my best friend died, I was very angry, very, very angry that someone 44 that was so vital and had these two kids that needed her so died. And but it's okay to embrace that. And so I talked a lot about it with my kids, and this is something that I would still really love to encourage people to talk to their children about what's happening. Um, because I talked a lot about my anger I was feeling. I talked about my deep sadness. And I remember one of them asking, "That's so hard. Are you so sorry you were her friend that you have to go through this?" I said, "I would not change this for one moment. The grief that I feel shows that I loved this person deeply, and I will always embrace that grief for knowing and loving the people that I do, the people that I care about." And so encourage your children to have these important conversations, because it goes back to saying that first decade of life is where it's really ingrained. Colleen, I want to ask you to share some about cognitive behavior theory therapy, because I know they talked about some studies that were done in 2018 and the results of this cognitive behavior therapy.
Well, they had the results specifically were successful with people who had anxiety in general, and they started to use it with people with death anxiety. And one of the interesting things with cognitive behavioral therapy is you have to question your thinking. So you have to ask yourself, well, what evidence do I really have for this thought? So one of the most common things that comes up, it just came up the other day with some friends of mine. One person says, "Well, I'm afraid death is painful. I don't want to be. It's painful." I said, "Well, let's look at that, because nowadays you don't have to suffer. They are well modulated. Your pain can be well modulated, and not all of people have pain when they die. It's the disease that causes the pain." And then there's something else that happens with cognitive behavior. You realize once you start questioning your thinking and you realize there's other ways to look at things, also, there are things you have no control over. And you have to, really look at what is the point of worrying about something you cannot control. So they have you draw a circle um, representing things within your complete control, and then what aspects of this would worry, would be inside that circle. Well, the problem is that a lot of stuff is outside of the circle, and that means you have no control over it. And so why worry about it? And I think that scares us in a way, because we like to have control. So cognitive therapy is very, very powerful. I've actually done some myself and realized it's all about questioning your thinking, and changing.
Mhm. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are the Gentle Passage Doula Collective, a different kind of doula. We train end-of-life doulas, and we also run death cafes, and those are once a month, and they're virtual. So you can go to our website to find our scheduled trainings, our death cafes, as well as webinars, just like here, discussing hot topics with discussion, answering questions. We have 5 of us that do the trainings, and we also have guests that come in and train. And you can join us on Facebook as well. We are the Gentle Passage Doula Collective on Facebook. And you can submit any topics or ideas that you have about what you want us to do on the show. And we hope to see you again. Thank you.